Hello YouTube, it's RJ the West here. We're back to another section of the story I'm working on. Well, you guys know what I'm saying. It's the Warframe story I've been working. Let's see. All right. Over the next several days, Samantha and James, with their new partners, James is beginning to feel depressed by the massive disruption to his routine. He misses Samantha greatly. He misses the way she brings him tea at just the right temperature. Now James has to work with a girl who doesn't take missions seriously. Her obnoxious and uncoordinated energy annoys James. Samantha feels unsettled by the change, as she is used to the safety of Limbo's rift. Without James, Samantha has to dodge and weave from bullets so often that it stresses her out. Every mission with Reggie feels like a battle for survival. Samantha returns from almost every mission with her Misa battered and beaten. Reggie doesn't even care. He only cares about the progress of the missions. The structured, predictable world James has built for himself was completely shattered. Over the next several days, the somatic chamber inside his orbiter felt cold and wrong. James was trapped in a deep, heavy depression. For an autistic mind, a disruption to a multi-year routine wasn't just inconvenient, it was physically painful. Every morning, he stared at his console, staring at the empty space where Samantha used to stand. He missed her with a fierce, quiet ache. He missed the precise, soothing 110 hertz frequency of her voice. Most of all, he missed the small things his mind relied on, like the way she used to silently place a flask of tea on his desk, always heated at exactly 62 degrees Celsius, without him even having to ask. Instead, his reality was now flooded with chaotic, uncoordinated noise. Hey Jimmy, watch this! Wendy's voice blasted through his comms channel, loud, hyperactive, and completely unbothered by tactical discipline. Through the somatic link, James watched Wisp float with a corpus tile set, giggling as she dropped her glowing reservoirs. To Wendy, the mission was a playground. She didn't calculate sight lines. She didn't map enemy formations, and her playful energy felt like sandpaper on James's raw nerves. She would constantly phase through walls, popping up next to Limbo just to startle him. Wendy, your positioning is highly inefficient, James muttered, his voice flat, completely drained of energy. Inside his paws, inside his pod, his fingers twitched erratically against his thigh as he tried to block out her constant humming. You are overextending into the enemy flanking. You are overextending into the enemy's flanking vector. Please maintain a distance of 5 meters. Lighten up, math boy. We're winning. Wendy laughed, throwing a glowing spectral clone across the room just to see if the Corpus Proxies chase it. James closed his eyes inside his helmet. Her absolute lack of seriousness was torturous. He didn't want to engage his cataclysm anymore. He didn't want to map the geometry of the void. Without Samantha's steady, anchoring logic, balancing his calculations, the rift felt like a cold, empty tomb. Meanwhile, miles away in another sector of the Origin system, Samantha was living through her own personal nightmare. She felt completely unsettled, her analytical armor wearing incredibly thin. For 2 years, for 2 years, she had operated under this absolute, invisible safety of Limbo's rift. She had been spoiled by James's brilliant mind, which has always folded space around her the exact millisecond danger approached. Now, that safety net was gone. Target sighted. Move to intercept. Do not deviate from the path. Reggie's voice droned over the comms. It was flat, detached, and completely void of human warmth. Reggie was 29, a seasoned killer who viewed the war solely through the lens of cold numbers. His warframe, Sight 9, was a lethal, calculating instrument of precision. Reggie didn't even miss a shot. But he also didn't care about anything else. He didn't look back to see if Samantha was keeping up. He didn't check her shields. He only cared about the objective. Without the rift, Samantha was forced to dodge, weave, and slide through a relentless hail of near heavy fire. Every mission felt like a desperate, exhausting battle for survival. Ping! Clang! Oops, been on the phone for a second. A volley of ballistic rounds smashed into Mesa's armored shoulder plates as Samantha rolled behind a piece of failing cover. Her heart rate was constantly spiking, not from the warm affection she felt around James, but from the sheer, unadulterated stress. She had to calculate bullet trajectories in real time while exposed to the raw, violent physics of the real world. Reggie. Well, I meant to say physics of the physical world. My bad on that, guys. Reggie, I need suppression fire on the upper catwalks, Samantha gasped, her breathing ragged as her shields began to deplete. My ballistic matrix is overwhelmed. Negative, Reggie replied coldly, his sight-9 frame aiming down a long-range scope, completely ignoring a squad of Grenier troopers closing in on a position. Suppressing that vector wastes ammunition. Elevate your own evasion metrics. The mission clock is ticking. Samantha grits her teeth, forcing Mesa to activate her shatter shield, but the sheer volume of enemy fire was just too much. By the time the mission concluded, Samantha staggered back into her orbiter, physically and mentally broken. Mesa's sleek gunslinger armor was battered, deeply dented and scorched black by plasma fire. She collapsed out of her somatic pod. Her real body is bruised and trembling from the feedback strain of a frame that had taken way too many hits. She stared at the maintenance log. Mesa was beaten to a pulp, and Reggie hadn't even stayed on the channel to debuff. He had logged off the second the extraction timer hit 0. He didn't care about her. He didn't care that she lived or died, as long as the data drive was secured. Sitting alone in the dark of her ship, rubbing her aching temples, Samantha looked at her comms console. She couldn't take this much longer. She needed her routine back. She needed her calculator. She needed James. Alright. While on a dangerous mission, James and Wendy were tasked to infiltrate a heavy corpus freighter. Wendy ignores James's suggestion to remain hidden from the MOAs. Wendy gets nearly overwhelmed by a swarm of corpus crewmen, MOAs, and Ospreys. James had his limbo open up a massive cataclysm to immobilize everything in the ship. James is holding back his anger towards Wendy's reckless abandon, nearly causing him to collapse the rift bubble that could destroy the ship. The alarms inside the heavy corpus freighter screamed at a deafening pitch. Red warning lights bathed in the corridors in a sickening glow. Wendy, halt! James said over the comms, his voice tight and strained. Inside his somatic pod, his knuckles were white. My telemetry maps a cluster of 42 shockwave MOBAs and shield ospreys in the next junction. The optimal path requires us to remain hidden. If we bypass them through the lower ventilation shafts, our detection probability drops to 0. I'm going to check to see if I'm even recording. I am. Excellent. Oh, come on, Jimmy. Where's the fun in crawling through dirt? Wendy's playful voice bubbled through the static, completely oblivious to the danger. Before James could pull up the exact mathematical proof of his strategy, Wisp floated directly past his cover. She didn't just walk out. She giggled, waving her hands as she dropped a glowing reservoir right in the middle of the main corridor. The Corpus Proxy Center snapped toward her instantly. Within seconds, the junction turned into a localized war zone. Wendy's playful, uncoordinated energy backfired catastrophically. The single squad of MOAs she thought she could handle suddenly cascaded into a swarm. Dozens of Corpus crewmen flooded the zone, backed by a relentless wall of automated MOAs and hovering Ospreys that instantly locked down the sector with overlapping plasma grids. Wisp was completely cut off, her shields violently shattering under the barrage of laser fire. Whoa, okay, that's a lot of bad guys, Wendy yelled, her playful tone finally cracking into panic as she desperately tried to phase away, only to get pinned by a heavy shockwave that slammed her frame to the bulkhead. James's brain short-circuited from raw, mounting fury. Her reckless abandon hadn't just ruined the mission parameters. It was the exact chaotic noise he despised. It was everything Samantha wasn't. If Samantha were here, they would have had cleared this room in the beautiful silent dance of perfect symmetry. Enough, James hissed. Through limbo, James unleashed every ounce of his somatic energy. He didn't just cast a pocket. He violently tore open a massive cataclysm bubble that expanded aggressively, consuming the entire midsection of the heavy freighter. Crack! The golden terror in reality swallowed everything. James slammed the stasis matrix into place. Instantly, the universe stopped. The swarm of crewmen froze mid-stride. The MOAs remained suspended in their firing stances. Thousands of blinding plasma bolts hung motionless in the air like a frozen field of deadly neon glass. Wisp froze too, hovering awkwardly a foot off the ground. Everything was immobilized, but the sheer size of the bubble, combined with James's roaring anger, pushed the rift to a volatile breaking point. Inside his pod, James was shaking violently. His teeth were grit so hard his jaw ached. He was so incredibly angry at Wendy, so deeply depressed from missing Samantha, and so overwhelmed by the sensory nightmare of the alarms that his hyper-focused mind began to fracture. Because of his emotional turbulence, the mathematics of the rift began to fail. The edges of the massive cataclysm started to violently fluctuate, sending spatial shock waves ripping through the freighter's structural hull. The ship's metal groaned under the immense dimensional pressure. If James lost his concentration for even a microsecond, the pocket dimension would violently collapse, causing a spatial implosion that would tear the heavy freighter and everyone in it into microscopic atomic dust. Maintain the constant, James gasped aloud to himself in his pod, tears of sheer mental exhaustion welling in his eyes. He forced his IEIQ brain to block out Wendy's muffled, frozen panic. He forced himself to visualize the exact comforting 62 degrees tea that Samantha always made him. He forced himself to remember the quiet frequency of her voice. Using Samantha's memory as an anchor, James slowly dialed the chaotic spatial fluctuations back into a perfect mathematical equilibrium, holding the unstable rift together by a single thread. While everything was in stasis, James stepped out of limbo and stood directly in front of Wisp and gave her a serious lecture. Wendy stepped out of her Wisp and almost started crying. She doesn't understand the gravity of the situation on the mission. Wendy notices that James looked like he had been crying. Inside the absolute stillness of the stasis field, the world was cast in a cold, shimmering gold. The alarms had gone silent. Their sound waves are frozen in midair. Millions of deadly plasma still hovered like a wall of glowing needles, just inches away from Wisp's chassis. Wisp could no longer contain his James could no longer contain his fury any longer. Through the somatic link, Limbo executed a swift, precise dash, stepping cleanly out of the rift plane. The frame materialized in the physical world, standing directly in front of the immobilized Wisp. Instantly, the link severed. The pod doors aboard James' orbiter slid open with a violent hiss. James didn't just speak through his comms. He used the ship's direct operator-to-operator projection override to force his physical silhouette to materialize right in front of Wendy's frame. Acknowledge physical presence, Wendy. Step out of your frame, now, James commanded. His voice wasn't flat anymore. It was sharp, trembling with a cold, terrifying intensity that cut through the silence. Startled by the raw hostility in his voice, the somatic link on Wendy's end disengaged. Her real body materialized out of Wisp's shadow, stepping onto the frozen deck plates. The playful, smirking expression she usually wore vanished instantly. Jimmy? What are you doing? We're in mid-mission. Look around you, James interrupted, his eyes wide, his body rigid and shaking as his hands twitched violently against his sides. He pointed a finger at the frozen plasma bolts and then at the groaning metal of the hull. Look at the spatial metrics. This is not a playground. This is a heavy Corpus freighter with a Class 4 reactor core. Your refusal to follow my stealth vector introduced 42 hostile variables in a closed system. Wendy took a step back. Her lower lip is trembling. She had never seen James like this. She always viewed him as a quiet, boring math guy who sat in his pod. She truly did not understand the gravity of the situations they were sent into. To her, the Tenno were immortal gods, and missions were just games to pass the time. She had no concept of tactical failure. You think your reservoirs make you invincible, James spat, his voice cracking from the immense emotional strain that he's been carrying for days. If my calculations fluctuates by even 0.001% right now, this pocket dimension collapses. Do you know what happens then, Wendy? A localized spatial implosion. The molecular structure of this ship would be torn apart. We would not just fail. Our somatic pods will experience complete neural backflush. We will cease to exist. You are endangering my life because you find crawling through ventilation shafts boring. Wendy's eyes welled with tears. The sheer weight of his words, combined with the terrifying sight of thousands of frozen plasma bolts hovering around her, she cracking, uh, finally cracked her playful shell. She felt incredibly small, completely overwhelmed by the reality of the danger she had carelessly caused. But as she looked at him to apologize, her breath caught. The projection of James was perfectly clear. His chest was heaving, his posture was completely broken, and his face was flushed. Red lines traced his eyes, and wet tear tracks stained his cheeks. He looked like he had just been crying long before this room was even flooded with enemies. He wasn't just angry about the Moas. He was grieving. James? Wendy whispered, her voice cracking as a tear finally spilled down her cheeks. Your eyes. You're crying. James instantly froze, his high IQ mind short-circuiting as she called out his physical vulnerability. He quietly wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, his fingers twitching erratically as he struggled to process the overwhelming emotional and sensory overload of the moment. He missed Samantha so much that it felt like a physical weight in his chest, and having this 19-year-old girl point out his pain only made the static in his head louder. My optimal moisture levels are irrelevant to the mission parameters, James muttered defensively, his voice dropping back into a stained, flat cadence. He turned away from her, his silhouette beginning to flicker. Re-engage your transference. We are extracting, and we are never pairing together again. Wendy apologized to James, begging to give her another chance. James accepted her apology, and Wendy now takes missions more seriously. One day, Wendy sees James quietly sobbing by the pod where Samantha used to be in. Wendy tries to make him feel better by bringing him tea. Wendy says, "Do you miss her, don't you?" Oh, James replying that he misses her very much. James explains that he misses everything about Samantha and deeply misses her and especially misses hearing her voice. He said it calms him. Wendy puts the tea beside him, and she sat down next to him, gently putting her hand on his shoulder. Wendy's apology inside the stasis field had been real. She had begged James for another chance, promising to change, and James, guided by pure logic, had accepted. True to her word, Wendy transformed. The childish giggles ceased. She began to check her vectors, respect sightlines, and take every mission with the gravity it deserved. But no amount of tactical discipline could fix the empty space in James's heart. A few days later, the orbiter was silent between missions. Wendy walked into the somatic chamber to log in their latest data, but she stopped dead in her tracks. James was sitting on the floor, leaning against the cold metal base of the pod where Samantha used to be. His knees were pulled to his chest. His shoulders shook in small, violent hitches. He was quietly sobbing, his fingers twitching in a broken, desperate rhythm against his shins. He was a genius who can map the infinite folds of the rift, but was completely powerless against the crushing weight of his own grief. Wendy's heart completely broke for him. She didn't just see a strict, angry math teacher anymore. She just saw a friend who was desperately lonely. Wanting to help, she ran to the kitchen module. She remembered how James always talked about his specific metrics, so she carefully brewed a cup of tea, tracking the temperature sensor until it hit exactly 62 degrees Celsius. She carried it back to the room, her footsteps soft. She knelt down beside him, placing the warm flask gently onto the floor. You miss her, don't you? Wendy asked, her voice dropping all of its usual high-energy bounce, replaced by a quiet, sincere gentleness. James didn't look up, but his sobbing slowed slightly. I miss her very much, he whispered, his voice incredibly small, thick with tears. He swallowed hard, his high IQ mind struggling to vocalize the chaotic symphony of pain inside his chest. I miss everything about Samantha. My brain. My brain cannot adapt to her absence. I miss the exact cadence of her movements. I miss the way she adjusted her ballistic data to fit my spatial models. And I deeply miss hearing her voice. It is exactly 110 hertz when she speaks to me. It is a perfect, steady frequency. It filters out the static in my head. It calms me. Without it, the universe is just noise. Wendy felt a lump from her Wendy felt a lump form in her throat. She realized that just how deeply these two were connected. It wasn't just a crush. Samantha was James's anchor in a world that constantly overwhelmed him. Wendy silently pushed the tea closer to his hand. Then she sat down on the cold floor next to him, moving slowly and predictably so she wouldn't startle him. She reached out and gently placed her hand on his shoulder, offering a steady, quiet presence. I know I can't be her, James, Wendy said softly, keeping her hand still and warm against his shoulder. And I know I'm not a perfect fit for your math, but you didn't have to carry all of this static by yourself. I'm right here. James stared at the tea, then looked at Wendy's hand on his shoulder. The touch was steady, just like Samantha's used to be. For the first time in days, the frantic twitching in his fingers began to slow down. Wendy begins to question the Lotus's motives as to why James and Samantha were separated, and wonders why she was assigned to be with James despite the contrast of personalities. James began to listen to her very well, and began to. Yeah, hold on a second, guys. James started to listen to what Wendy is saying and begins to think it is possible that Lotus is sabotaging his progress as a limbo operator. James explains to Wendy that for the 2 years he and Samantha have been working together, that he had made great progress in mastering the rift plane, that he is getting closer to learning how to perform a rift jump, which destroyed the original Limbo. James then explained to Wendy that it is only when they were beginning to have romantic feelings towards each other is when the Lotus stepped in to separate the two, saying that he was emotionally unstable because of Samantha. Wendy, despite her high energy and playful behavior, thinks the Lotus is weaponizing his autism against him. James stopped crying. His fingers stayed frozen against his shin as his high IQ mind seized upon the words Wendy had just spoken. The heavy, suffocating static in his chest suddenly gave way to a cold, razor-sharp focus. Wendy sat quietly beside him, her warm hand still resting predictably on his shoulder. She looked down at the tea, her brow furrowed as her newly disciplined tactical mind began to fit pieces together that didn't make sense. James, Wendy said, her voice dropping into a serious, questioning whisper. Why did the Lotus separate you two? I mean, she told us it was for tactical optimization in emotional distance, but look at us. Our personalities are completely opposite. If she wanted maximum efficiency, why pair an extreme analytical planner like you with someone fluid and chaotic like me? It doesn't add up. James turned his head slowly, his tear-streaked face tightening. He looked at Wendy, really listening to her, tracking the trajectory of her logic. The probability of the Lotus making a calculation error regarding frame synergy is less than 0.5%, James murmured, his mind spinning up a massive data web, therefore the disruption to my routine. It was not an accidental byproduct. It was the intended outcome. He stood up abruptly, the sudden surge of adrenaline clearing his sensory overload. He began to pace the floor of the somatic chamber, his footsteps falling into a rapid rhythmic sequence. For 2 years, Samantha and I operated in near flawless synchronization, James explained to Wendy, his voice growing faster and sharper. The Lotus told me I was overextending my somatic energy out of fear, but she left out the historical baseline. Over those 2 years, my control over the rift plane didn't degrade. It has advanced exponentially. I have been mapping higher dimensional vectors that no limbo operator has ever touched since the old war. He stopped, staring blankly at the empty pod where Samantha used to sleep. I am close, Wendy, James whispered, a tremor of awe and fear in his voice. I am getting closer and learning how to perform a true, stable rift jump. The exact dimensional displacement that tore apart and destroyed the original limbo because his mathematics fractured. I have solved the structural equations that he missed, and I only solved them because of Samantha's 110 hertz frequency kept my neural pathways anchored. She was the only thing preventing my brain from overloading when I touched the deep void. Wendy stood up, her jaw dropping as she realized the terrifying truth. And the Lotus knows that. Yes, James hissed, his fists clenching as the equation finally resolved into a horrifying answer. The Lotus has been logging my telemetry from the very beginning. She isn't trying to protect my neural stability. She is sabotaging my progress. She is intentionally hindering my abilities because a limbo operator who can seamlessly cross dimensions without destroying their frame is an uncontrollable variable. Think about the timing, James, Wendy said, her eyes flashing with anger as she stepped closer. Despite her useful, playful nature, she possessed a fierce protective streak. You two worked together for 2 whole years, and she let it slide. It was only when you and Samantha started developing real, deep romantic feelings toward each other, when you were about to lock in that bond, that she stepped in. She told you apart, but she tore you apart and blamed your emotions, calling you unstable. Wendy shook her head, a disgust curling her lips. She's weaponizing your autism against you, James. She knows your brain relies on Samantha's voice to filter out the noise. She knows that pulling Samantha away would cause a massive cognitive crash, break your routine, and throw you into a depression. She used your need for structure to cripple your mind, making sure you'd never be strong enough to finish that rift jump calculation. James stood perfectly still, the words echoing in the quiet chamber. The Lotus, their guide, the mother of the Tenno, had analyzed his neurological traits and used them as a tactical off switch to keep him weak. The sorrow in James's chest instantly crystallized into a cold, unbreakable resolve. The math was no longer about completing the Lotus's missions. The math was now about survival. After nearly dying in a large Grineer frigate, Samantha had reached her breaking point. Reggie starts to notice her distress and walks over to her. He gently pats his hand on her shoulder, and Samantha pushes it away, saying, "Okay, blah, blah, blah." Sorry, that's just the prompt for the story, guys. Skip, skip, skip. Samantha explains to Reggie on a day she and James were paired by the Lotus 2 years ago that because of their personalities, they were compatible with optimal performance. Reggie pointed out that it's no coincidence that the Lotus had them separated the moment she developed feelings for James and questioned why he was paired up with her instead of a more suitable operator. Samantha blames herself for falling in love with James and feels more like she's being punished by the Lotus. The extraction pod hissed shut against the vacuum, but the stench of scorched metal and Grenier ozone still clung to Mazer's shattered armor. Samantha had nearly died. A heavy Grenier frigate patrol had ambushed them, and without Limbo's rift to fold space around her, she had been forced to take the full brunt of a heavy plasma blast just to secure the target. Mesa's shields were completely fried. Her own body inside the somatic pod was shaking violently from the feedback shock, her breathing ragged, her analytical mind completely overwhelmed by sheer exhaustion. She had reached her absolute breaking point. Reggie stepped out of his Site 9 somatic pod, for he was 29, cold, and typically entirely detached, but even his heavily observant mindset could not ignore the catastrophic state of her vitals. He walked across the steel floor of the shared chamber, his footsteps echoing heavily. He stopped right beside her trembling form and reached down, gently putting his hand on her shoulder to stabilize her. Samantha violently flinched. She shoved his hand away with a sudden, desperate surge of strength. "Please don't touch me," Samantha gasped, her voice cracking as she pulled her arms tightly against her chest. It wasn't a reflex. It wasn't just a reflex. The thought of another man's touch completely repulsed her. Her skin crawled at the sensory difference. It wasn't the predictable, careful, familiar warmth of James's hands. Any touch that wasn't his felt like an invasive, chaotic violation of her personal space. Reggie didn't get angry. He didn't pull away in disgust. He simply absorbed the data of her reaction, his observant eyes narrowing. He slowly sat down on the cold bench beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "You love him, don't you?" Reggie asked, his voice flat but entirely lacking its usual mission-first hostility. Samantha buried her face in her hands, a solitary, painful sob escaping her throat. "2 years ago," she whispered, her voice trembling, "the day Lotus paired James and I analyzed him. He was autistic, high IQ, and completely overwhelmed by the noise of the relay. My mind was purely analytical. We fit. Because of our personalities, we were perfectly compatible for optimal performance. I became his anchor, and his math became my safety. We were flawless. Reggie stared at the dented floor plating, processing her words. He tilted his head. It is no coincidence, Samantha. Samantha looked up, her eyes red and stained. What? Look at the timeline, Reggie said, his observant mind laying out the facts like a tactical map. The Lotus separated you the exact moment you developed deep, unyielding romantic feelings for him. If she wanted maximum efficiency for the origin system, she would have kept you guys together. Your synergy charts were historic. Instead, she pulls you apart and pairs you with me, a man who focuses entirely on missions, ignores your defensive metrics, and maintains absolute emotional distance. It is highly illogical. I am not a suitable operator for a high mobility gunslinger frame like Mesa. I belong with a heavy defense units. Samantha's head dropped, a wave of crushing guilt washing over her. It's my fault, she choked out, tears finally spilling over her hands. I broke protocol. I allowed myself to fall in love with a compromised operator. James was making incredible progress with his rift jump calculations, and I let my emotions distract him. I am being punished by the Lotus. She pulled him away to fix my mistake. She is punishing me for loving him. Reggie remained quiet, watching her shoulders heave. For a man who was supposed to be completely emotionally distant, a dark realization was beginning to form in his own mind that the mother of the about the mother of the Tenno. The Lotus wasn't punishing Samantha for their mistake. She was punishing them for becoming too powerful together. The Lotus sent Samantha and Reggie to the gas city on Jupiter to gather valuable data, but they were caught in a trap that was placed by Alad V. The trap was a sprung nullified field that severed the neural link of the warframes and the operator, forcing the two oper- and the operator, forcing the two operators out of their warframes. The Corpus crewmen rushed in to seize them, and that's when Alad V walks in, mocking them for their situation. Alad V mocks Samantha for relying on James and his limbo, and Reggie for focusing too heavily on mission progress over the safety of his squad. Check my time real quick, guys. Okay, we got plenty of time. The air inside the Jovian gas city hissed with the toxic tang of methane and hypercooled coolant. The Lotus had sent Samantha and Reggie into the heart of the corporate laboratories to extract highly classified data, but the mission parameters had been a lie from the start. Alad V has been waiting. Just as Samantha reached for the primary console, the floor panels erupted with a blinding violent light. A colossal pressurized nullifier field snapped into existence, engulfing the entire laboratory. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The violent energy field violently severed the transference system, tearing both operators completely out of their somatic links. Samantha and Reggie were violently ejected from their frames, tumbling onto the hard, grated floor in their fragile physical human bodies. Behind them, Mesa and Site 9 collapsed into lifeless, frozen husks of cold metal. Intruders isolated. Close all sectors. A swarm of Corpus crewmen, armed with high-voltage Detron rifles, rushed into the chamber from the upper catwalks, their boots clicking sharply against the steel. They formed a tight, lethal perimeter, aiming their weapons directly at the two defensive operators. Through the dense wall of soldiers, a familiar nasally laugh echoed. Alad V walked into the room, his sleek silk robes brushing against the floor, his mechanical collar whirling as his cybernetic implants glowed in the dim light. He looked down at Samantha and Reggie with a grotesque, mocking grin, thoroughly enjoying their absolute helplessness. Oh, look! What the void dragged into my parlor. Elad V purred, clapping his hands together in mock applause. The Lotus's finest little puppets, completely untethered by their favorite toys. How tragic. How utterly unprofitable. He stepped closer, his boots just stopping inches from Samantha, who was fiercely clutching her bruised ribs on the floor. And you, Alad V sneered, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at her with pure derision. The brilliant, analytical Samantha. Look at you now. You look so small without your top-hatted savior, don't you? Do you really think I wouldn't notice your son drop in combat efficiency? You spent 2 years letting that little autistic boy fold space around you, hiding like a coward inside Limbo's rift. You relied so heavily on his math to keep you safe that you forgot how to survive a real firefight. And now, he isn't here to snap his fingers and save you from my knives. Samantha grits her teeth, glaring up at him with pure hatred, though a cold dread washed over her as she realized Alad V had been logging her and James's data all along. Alad V turned his gaze to Reggie, who was standing rigid, his observant eyes desperately mapping the room for an exit vector despite the guns trained on his chest. And Reggie, Alad V chuckled, shaking his head. The perfect unfeeling soldier. The Lotus's obedient little dog. You focused so heavily on the cold mission progress, didn't you? Always watching the clock, always calculating the quotas, entirely blind to the safety of your own squad. A true corporate mind, but bad leadership. Reggie always leads to a Reggie always leads to a hostile takeover. Your emotional distance. Oh, sorry, he's still talking. I forgot about that. Reggie always leads to a hostile takeover. Your emotional distance didn't make you efficient. It made you predictable. And predictability is a massive liability in my market. Alad V raised his hand, signaling the crewmen to prime their weapons, secure them. I believe the Mutalist strain will find their biological components highly fascinating. Alright, check my time. Alright, we're going to stop here, guys, and I'll see you on the next video. Take care, everyone.